Hello, everyone, and welcome tonight. This is Glenn Rawson. Behind me, that's Pine Mountain, and in between here and there are the Red Rock of the St. George and Washington area. I came down here to spend some time with some friends, went out, did a little bit of jeeping and doing a lot of studying of church history while I'm down here. I've had a great weekend. I hope yours has gone as well. Just a couple of things before I begin the fireside tonight. The first one is coming up on the 24th of February, which means like just a few days. Dennis and I are going to take a group of people from Idaho all the way to San Diego, and we're going to stop at some of the pioneer temples along the way. We'll spend the night on the way down in St. George and spend some time in the St. George Temple, and I'll be talking about temple history. And then on the way back, we'll do the Manti Temple. And so there's going to be a lot of church history. It's going to be a fun drive, 2 temple sessions. That tour goes on the 24th of February. And if you'd like more information, it's only a 6-day tour. If you'd like more information, go to TetonStagelines.com. And then also with TetonStagelines.com, some of you have been with Donovan and Jackie Harrington out of Idaho and have gone to the Mesa pageant. That pageant is still going. We're taking a group down there on the 14th of April. And once again, we'll do the pageant and have a lot of fun and a lot of church history along the way. So that's the Mesa pageant tour on April 14th. And then, lastly for this segment right now, I'm sure that most of you have been on trek to Martin's Cove. But have you ever had the opportunity to really learn the history of Martin's Cove, Devil's Gate, and the Martin and Willie Handcart companies? On May 1st, Dennis and I will take a group and go out to Martin's Cove for a 3-day tour. We will go out there, we'll walk around and see the sights at Martin's Cove, and we'll see all the sights in the surrounding area. And I will tell you the story of Martin and Willie, what really happened from their own mouths. It's a 3-day tour. If you'd like to come, again, that will be May 1st. If you'd like to come, well, seats are limited. Go to historyofthesaints.org for that tour, and you can get information there. All right. As always, I would ask for an interest in your faith and prayers tonight. I hope and pray that somebody is edified by what I have to say. This first story goes back to Valentine's Day. Kindness and respect, do they matter? Seems like they're in short supply in this world today. If I might, I would like to tell you the story of a single act of kindness that affected the lives of billions, down to the present day. In fact, even affected your life. The ancient patriarch Abraham was old and well stricken in age. He was concerned that his son Isaac was not yet married. So, as you know the story, he called for his most trusted servant, and in the custom of the day sent him back to the land of Abraham's ancestry, Ur of the Chaldees, to negotiate for a wife for Isaac. Now, that ought to seem a little strange to most of us, but for the servant, it was not just strange, it was a daunting task. He was to travel to a land he did not know, find a family he had never met, and persuade a girl to leave her home and kin forever and marry a total stranger. Nothing to it. Dubious, but faithful, the servant loaded up 10 camels with wealth and set out for Mesopotamia, arriving at the well on the outskirts of the village, just as the women were coming to draw water for the evening. Now, which maiden is she? How does the servant find her? The servant then prayed, O Lord God of my master Abraham, let it come to pass that the damsel to whom I shall say, let down thy pitcher, I pray thee, that I may drink, and she shall say, drink, and I will give thy camels drink also. Let the same be she that thou hast appointed for my servant Isaac. End of quote. Well, he hadn't even finished the prayer before a very lovely young woman approached the well, filled her pitcher, and started back home. He ran and asked her for a drink. She gave him a drink and then said, I will draw water for thy camels also. That may not seem like a big deal to you and I, but do you know how much water 10 thirsty camels can drink? More than 250 gallons. No one had known the likes of Rebekah. The servant watched her in wonder. Could this really be her? Could it be that easy? She had passed the first test, but even more importantly, was she of the covenant lineage? Well, it turned out she was. Rebekah invited Abraham's servant to her home, where the man presented an incredible story to her family of why he was there. The next morning, Rebekah's family put the decision to her. Wilt thou go with this man? And she said, I will go. Fast forward. It was evening. Isaac went out into the fields to meditate. In the distance, he saw the camels coming. From atop one of the camels, Rebekah saw him and asked, What man is that walketh in the field to meet us? When she learned that it was him, she came down from the camel, veiled her face as a bride would, and went to meet him. The scripture says Isaac took Rebekah, and she became his wife, and he loved her. End of quote. If you know anything about the covenant promises of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Rebekah became the mother of thousands of millions. Nations today call her mother, probably even you, and all because of a timely act of kindness coupled with simple faith. My friends, kindness really does matter. Next story. This story is part of a book that I'm just finishing up on the patriotic fathers of our country. I hope you enjoy this story. September 1776, New York City. George Washington watched from New York as British soldiers landed in great numbers on Long Island. It appeared that the British General Howe intended on making a major offensive and taking New York. But where and when? General Washington needed information badly. Well, the traditional ways of doing it weren't working, so he asked for spies of Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Knowlton and his Rangers. Now, Knowlton is often referred to as America's first intelligence officer. Knowlton gathered his officers and asked for a volunteer to undertake what many considered an absolute suicide mission: to dress in civilian clothes and go among the British forces gathering information. If caught, an active duty soldier caught in civilian clothes behind enemy lines, it was an automatic and immediate death sentence. Well, as Knowlton asked for volunteers, no one did. Not only was danger a deterrent, but a spy Even for the cause of the revolution, a spy was considered lowly, a scoundrel, and a disgrace. Well, right in the middle of Knowlton's meeting, one of Knowlton's officers walked in, a 24-year-old captain, an educated graduate of Yale University. His name was Nathan Hale. It is said that Hale appeared pale, sweating, sickly, and barely able to stand on his feet. End of quote. Why? Because he'd had a long and severe bout of the flu. Learning what his commanding officer was asking, Hale immediately stepped forward and declared, quote, "I will undertake it, sir." His fellow officers immediately protested. They tried to persuade him, but Hale stood firm. He is reported to have said, quote, "I am fully sensible of the consequences of discovery and capture in such a situation, but for a year I have been attached to the Army and have not rendered any material services while receiving compensation for which I make no return." End of quote. In other words, I've been on the pay of the Army for a year and I haven't done anything to earn it. And with that, Hale walked out of the meeting. Friends came forward and tried to talk him out of this crazy mission, to which Hale responded, again, listen to this. He said, "I am not influenced by the expectation of promotion or pecuniary reward. I wish to be useful, and every kind of service necessary to the public good becomes honorable by being necessary. If the exigencies of my country demand a peculiar service, its claims to perform that service are imperious." End of quote. If my country needs me, no matter what the service, I will go. So accordingly, Nathan Hale crossed over to Long Island dressed in civilian clothes and moved among the British Army, talking, taking notes, asking questions, and drawing maps. Little did he know that he was drawing suspicion. On September 21st, having completed his mission and preparing to return with his papers tucked in his shoes, Nathan Hale was betrayed by a pretended friend into the hands of the British. Captain Hale was taken before General Howe, who summarily condemned him without any form of trial. According to witnesses, Hale said to the general, quote, "I regret that I had not been able to serve my country better." He was sentenced to be hung the next morning. Nathan asked the general for a chaplain. That request was denied. He asked for a Bible. He was a Christian. That too was denied. The next morning, Captain Nathan Hale was led out to an apple orchard where he climbed the ladder and received the hangman's noose. Witnesses said, quote, "He stood proudly, head tilted skyward, posture firm, hands tied behind his back," end of quote. And then, according to those present, Captain Nathan Hale said, and this is what he really said, quote, "I am so satisfied with the cause in which I have engaged that my only regret is that I have not more lives than one to offer in its service." End of quote. To the horrors of the onlookers, Hale was kicked off the ladder and hung. And if that was not brutal and callous enough, his body was left hanging for 3 days in the summer sun, and he was mocked and spit upon. Finally, a slave cut him down and buried him on the spot in an unmarked and today unknown grave. Thus was the ignominious death of America's first spy. He died considering that he had done his duty to his country and that his death was a service to God and man and country. It would only be months later that his family would finally learn what happened to him, and decades later, when the rest of America would learn of the duty and sacrifice of this noble young Christian. Historian M. William Phelps said it best of Nathan Hale. When the British strung Nathan Hale up and hanged him, they did so to end his influence on the American effort. And yet, at the moment Nathan died on the end of that rope, the British gave birth to a national icon of liberty and patriotism. End of quote. Think about it. Why do we love and revere that story? My friends, virtue, honor, duty, and sacrifice, these are what made America great the first time. They are the only way to make America great again. Next story. President's Day. Consider this story. June 15th, 1775. The American colonies were at war with Mother England. The Continental Congress voted unanimously and appointed one of its members to be commander-in-chief of the... Sorry, cell phone. Appointed one of its members, 43-year-old George Washington, to be the commander-in-chief of the army. He stood before them and said, and I quote, "I beg it may be remembered by every gentleman in this room that I do not think myself equal to this command I am honored with." End of quote. 8 years later, by the grace of God and the genius of Washington, the war was won, and America, the land of divine destiny, was a free nation. And then what happened? General Washington gave up his power and returned to the private life of a farmer at Mount Vernon. He was, beyond doubt, America's most revered hero and their principal respected citizen. But the revolution was won, but the country was yet in turmoil. The existing government, the Articles of Confederation, it was weak, impotent. James Madison and others pled with Washington to attend a convention for the purpose of revising the government. Reluctantly, at the call, Washington again left Mount Vernon for the Constitutional Convention and service to his country. May 15th, 1787, the delegates to the Constitutional Convention entered the Pennsylvania State House to begin the task of restructuring the national government. No sooner were they seated than Washington was elected unanimously the president of the Constitutional Convention. 5 months later, by the wisdom of the greatest minds of that century, and a lot of compromise and discussion, the Constitution of the United States was drafted and sent to the states for ratification. The debates were hot and furious. Foremost among the objections to the new Constitution, the new system of government, was the awesome power that the document placed in the hands of the office of President of the United States. Too much power, they said, in one man. As it turns out, the Constitution was finally ratified with the clear understanding that only one man in America could be trusted at that time with that much power. And on February the 4th, 1789, George Washington was, and notice this, unanimously elected President of the United States. And so on April 14th, 1789, once again, answering the call of his country, Washington left Mount Vernon with a heavy heart, feeling, he said, like a culprit going to his execution. End of quote. 16 days later, he stood on the balcony of Federal Hall in New York. With a multitude watching, he placed his hand on the Bible and repeated the constitutional oath of office, saying, quote, I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. And then, Washington, of his own accord, hand on the Bible, added the following, so help me God. And then, it is reported that he bent down and kissed the Bible. The grand experiment in Republican government, the grand experiment that men could be self-governing, a revolution in the world, was now underway. Washington would go on to be unanimously elected to 2 terms as president and guide a fledgling nation to find its wings in fly. In 1797, he refused to be elected to a 3rd term. 2 was enough. He retired to Mount Vernon and his family. 2 years later, 1799, after more than 40 of his 67 years in public service, George Washington died quietly at his home. George Washington was raised up by the Almighty to assist in establishing this free land. The ramifications of that man's mission and the results that came of it are beyond all mortal comprehension. I find it interesting that Washington said this, quote, no people can be bound to acknowledge and adore the invisible hand which conducts the affairs of men more than those of the United States. Every step by which they, America, have advanced to the character of an independent nation seems to have been distinguished by some token of providential agency. First inaugural address. I'm going to undertake a study in the next few days to study the characters, the men and women of the founding generation of America. It is my conviction, and I tell you right up front, that there was never a time in American history when our greatest and most inspired minds were our statesmen. I believe that. I'll get back to you on this. Let's take a break. First of all, how are you? I hope you are well. I hope you feel the Lord's arms around you, the encircling arms of love, and I hope that you're happy. Coming up in May, we're going to do the cowboy tour again. Dennis and I took a group and went out to Mount Rushmore, and we talked horses and cows and cowboys, and we did for a week, and we had so much fun going through Yellowstone Park and going through Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and on across Wyoming and over to Mount Rushmore, and oh my word, it was so much fun. One of the funnest tours I've ever done. We're doing it again in May. And then the Pioneer Trail tour, going from Nauvoo back to Salt Lake along the Pioneer Trail in July. And finally, the story of the Mormon Battalion in California, that tour in August. If any of these 3 tours might be of interest to you, go to historyofthesaints.org. and I would love to take you. Okay? Moving on. The year was 1908, and the place was the seaside village of Felixstowe, Suffolk, England. A Latter-day Saint missionary came into the community named Moses Edwards. He was from Manderfield, Utah, just up the road. In his labors, Edwards introduced the restored gospel to the Alexander and Marianne Beeson family and invited them to come to church. Now, it is said that the father, Alexander, readily accepted the teachings and belief of the church and very much embraced the gospel. However, in that day and time, the church was not popular in England, and folks feared the mobs should they attempt to attend LDS church services. Still quoting, mobs would gather on Sunday morning and block the way of the people going to church. Well, on that day, the Beeson family took a side street and worked their way along the riverfront, approaching the meeting house from a different direction. Can you imagine having to sneak by stealth into the church building in fear of your life? Would you go to church? Well, as the family walked into the meeting, it had already begun, and the congregation was singing the hymn, number 2, "The Spirit of God like a fire is burning." According to Beeson family records, one youthful voice stood out above them all. Quoting, "There was a young boy in the congregation who was singing with a beautiful voice. Alexander's son, Frank, heard that and immediately felt a calming spirit within the chapel, forgetting all about the mobs outside. Evidently, others in the family felt the same, and the family was baptized not long after. In 1909, Father Beeson immigrated to Zion. In 1910, the rest of the family joined him. They settled in Beaver, Utah, where they lived out the remainder of their days in faith. And by the way, that boy with the beautiful voice, his name was Herb Carsey, and he and 14-year-old Frank became fast friends. When the Beeson family settled in Beaver, Utah, the Carsey family also immigrated from England and settled in Magna, Utah. The friendship of those two lads deepened and lasted the rest of their days. And so I ask, who can measure the good across generations that one English lad singing with inspired power was able to accomplish? How many lives did he change? How do you sing? Next story. Clouding over. It might rain. I don't know. We'll see. Eliza Roberts was born in 1817 in Gloucestershire, England, into a family of 8 children. When she was 19, she married John Cox. It appears likely that John and Eliza were among those converted through the efforts of Wilford Woodruff and others in 1840, somewhere around Gadfield Elm. Indeed, they were baptized by Daniel Browett. Well, on February 6, 1841, a group of 109 saints departed Liverpool aboard the sailing ship Echo, bound for America. Records indicate that one of the Cox children passed away and was buried at sea. John and Eliza arrived in Nauvoo and lived in the Nauvoo Second Ward. 2 more children came. After the martyrdom of the prophet Joseph and Hiram, John and Eliza left Nauvoo in May 1846. Once they arrived at the Missouri River, Captain James Allen of the United States Army came seeking recruits to enlist in the Army to fight in the war with Mexico. Accordingly, July 16, 1846, John Cox, the recent immigrant from England, was sworn into the Army and assigned to Company E. They marched away shortly after, leaving wives and families behind. Well, Eliza took her children and moved across the Missouri River on the west side to Cutler's Park. While there, in November, she gave birth to a little girl, Sarah, in a wagon box. She then moved into a small cabin 10 feet square with her 4 children. Then disease settled into the family, and 3-year-old Mariah died, as well as the baby, Sarah. Eliza was then forced by the United States government to move her family back to the Iowa side of the Missouri River. Meanwhile, clear out west, July 16, 1847, John was discharged from the Army in Los Angeles. He traveled north from Los Angeles and spent the winter working for John Sutter in building a mill. He was there when gold was discovered in January of 1848. In June of that same year, 1848, John then set out with others of the battalion boys to go east now and finally find his family. On June 28th, in the foothills below the mountains themselves, 3 men went ahead in a scouting party to find a route over the Sierra Nevadas. They didn't come back. Later, those men were found, mutilated, murdered, and buried, some believing that they were killed by Native Americans. The 3 men killed were Ezra Allen, Henderson Cox, and tragically, the man who had been instrumental in John and Eliza's conversion back in England, Daniel Browett. That place is known to this day as Tragedy Springs. Word spread east of the murders, reaching Eliza Cox on the Missouri, except Eliza was told that the murdered man was not Henderson Cox, but John Cox, her beloved husband. Eliza was so afflicted by the awful news that the record says she was reduced to what she described as hysterical fits. Even after Eliza later learned that her husband was alive, the fits and affliction continued the rest of her life. John finally found Eliza on the Missouri, and there they remained in order to make enough money to outfit for the journey west. Another daughter, Eliza Jane, was born. By 1853, they had made their way to the Salt Lake Valley and settled in Grantsville, and it was there that 2 more girls were born, Martha Marinda and Margaret Ellen. Later on, the family moved to South Weber, where several more children joined the family. In all, Eliza said she gave birth to 12 children, gifts from the bosom of God, her patriarchal blessing said. But of those 12 children, only 6 lived to adulthood. On December 29, 1867, John and Eliza received their endowments and were sealed in the endowment house in Salt Lake City by Heber C. Kimball. 2 years later, 1869, they moved to Oxford, Idaho, where they farmed and raised their children. April 1st, 1878, the Venerable John Cox died in Oxford. Eliza lived on, moved away to Vernal, Utah with her daughters, and lived, quote, in a humble log home with very few possessions, end of quote. When exactly Eliza Cox passed away, no one knows for sure, but it was sometime in 1890. And according to the most recent records I found, she lies buried in an unmarked grave in the Vernal, Utah cemetery. forgotten, or so it would appear. And think of all the hardship. Eliza left her land, her homeland, her family, everything behind to join the saints in Zion. While her husband gave his all to the Mormon Battalion, Eliza kept the faith and her home and hearth together. She never had much of this world's goods, and she lost so many children along the way. And yet, through all of that suffering, she was, quote, humble and faithful to the end. Her patriarchal blessing was given her by Isaac Morley, and in it is this promise, quote, thy children will honor thee and revere thy counsel. They will preserve thy name and memory from generation to generation. And so they shall. Eliza Cox was my third great-grandmother. And what an example she is. Next story. There are moments in America's revolutionary struggle for freedom that defy natural descriptions and explanations and boldly belie the word coincidence. In other words, the only way to describe them is miraculous. And this is one of those. March 4th, 1776, Boston, Massachusetts. Reverend William Gordon described that night, March 4th, as follows, quote, a finer night for working could not have been taken out of the whole 365. It was hazy below the Dorchester Heights, so that our people could not be seen, even though it was a bright moonlit night above the hills. End of quote. Well, on this ideal night in Boston, what work was needing to be done? What was going on? Well, after the battles of Lexington and Concord, British forces retreated back to Boston and took control of the city. Colonial forces, later commanded by General George Washington, laid siege to the city of Boston beginning on April 19, 1775. That siege lasted nearly a year because neither side, British or American, could overcome and uproot the other. Because of that standoff, General Henry Knox came up with a brilliant idea. They would go up to Fort Ticonderoga, and they would transport cannon and artillery from Ticonderoga all the way to Boston, a distance of 300 miles across rivers and lakes, and that in the winter, and bring it to Boston. The artillery, the cannon, would then be placed up on Dorchester Heights, looking right down on Boston. That strategy, with that kind of firepower, would give the Americans the high ground and a commanding position over the British, including the British ships in the harbor. It was a brilliant plan, and Knox pulled it off beautifully. He got the cannon. But now that he had him in Boston, how are we going to get the cannons up on top of Dorchester Heights, that much moving and that much work, without the British seeing it? If they saw, they would attack immediately, and no advantage would be gained. So the plan was made to bring the cannon up at night in secret. All was prepared to move those cannons into place. Fog settled in down near the ground so that no one could track the movements of the Americans as they began moving the cannon. But the moon shone brightly overhead. George Washington and his men began moving those cannon and artillery into place, along with all manner of fortifications. The weather was warm and perfect. Around 10 o'clock that night, a British officer named Campbell reported to his superiors, quote, "The rebels were at work on Dorchester Heights." Now that news should have sent the British into a panic because they all knew what that ground meant. But the report was ignored. By dawn, when the sun came up, all was in place. Cannons mounted, artillery in place, fortifications built up, and men dug in and ready to fight. The British were stunned. The surprise was total. One British officer referred to it as, quote, "a most astonishing night's work." And there were other statements to that effect. Well, the British immediately responded by opening fire with their cannon at the fortification on Dorchester Heights, but they couldn't elevate their guns sufficiently to have any effect. Knowing the imminent danger, General Howe then made the decision to muster his forces and attack the Americans on Dorchester Heights immediately. Now, his men remembered the battle at Lexington and Concord, and also remembered their losses at Bunker Hill. They considered that it was absolute madness to attack the Americans entrenched up on that hill. But ego and hubris carried the day. Guys with four-wheelers, I'm in their way. But ego and hubris carried the day, and British forces began immediately to mobilize for the battle. By early afternoon, however, here comes the British, thousands of them, preparing to mount an attack on the Americans. But then the weather began to change. By nightfall, quote, "the wind blew almost a hurricane," one observer said. Hail, snow, and sleet began to pound Boston. How bad was it? Windows were broken, fences blown over, ships were blown ashore, and the British were pinned down. The attack was called off. The British retreated. Had they gone ahead with their plans, many lives would have been lost on both sides, and in the end, more than likely, Boston would have remained under British control. As it was, General Howe had no choice but to evacuate his entire force as soon as possible. Though General Washington wanted the fight, he would later attribute the storm of March 5th, 1776, quote, "to the intervening hand of God," end quote. As historian David McCullough has written, it was a spectacle such as could only have been imagined until that morning. There were 120 ships departing with more than 11,000 people packed on board, end quote. Abigail Adams wrote, "Surely it is the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes," end quote. Boston was liberated. The British were, quote, "completely disgraced," and they never returned. It was virtually a bloodless victory and a monumental boost to the esteem of Washington and the morale of the Continental Army. Truly, this moment and this victory turned the Continental Army from a provincial militia to a Continental Army. In a letter to Samuel Langdon, dated much later, September 1789, Washington wrote, quote, The man must be bad indeed who can look upon the events of the American Revolution without feeling the warmest gratitude towards the great author of the universe, whose divine interposition was so frequently manifested on our behalf. End of quote. Those events in Boston were but the beginning of the miracles that won American independence. If we won by miracles then, we will need miracles and faith to survive now. My dear friends, good night. God bless.